If it's Friday, President Biden swings into campaign mode, heading for battleground Pennsylvania and Georgia, following that fiery and combative State of the Union address. Plus, all in the family, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law is installed atop the Republican National Committee as the party throws its financial and political power behind a presumptive nominee who is saddled with legal fees and enormous fines. And President Biden bypasses Israel with his own humanitarian mission into Gaza as he pressures Prime Minister Netanyahu to do more to address the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinian civilians. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where the general election has begun with a bang. Fresh off last night's fiery State of the Union address, where he repeatedly went after the presumptive Republican presidential nominee, Donald Trump, President Biden is now hitting the campaign trail. He just arrived in battleground Pennsylvania ahead of a campaign event set to begin next hour. This will kick off a 2-week travel blitz. That will feature members of the administration crisscrossing the country in what the campaign is calling a, quote, month of action. Tomorrow, both Donald Trump and President Biden will be on the ground in battleground Georgia. The action on the trail comes after the president delivered a defiant State of the Union as he sought to push back against critics and reassure Democrats that he's up for a grueling re-election fight amid lagging poll numbers and concerns about his age. The president took the issue of age head on, leaning into a favorite campaign refrain. Take a look.
I know it may not look like it, but I've been around a while. When you get to be my age, certain things become clearer than ever. I know the American story. Again and again, I've seen the contest between competing forces in the battle for the soul of our nation.
He used the speech to slam his presumptive general election opponent, referring to former President Trump as, quote, my predecessor at least 13 times, including references to January 6th, Russia, and the Dobbs decision to overturn Roe v. Wade.
My predecessor and some of you here seek to bury the truth about January 6th. I will not do that. Now my predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, do whatever the hell you want. My predecessor came to office determined to see Roe v. Wade overturned. He's the reason it was overturned, and he brags about it. And if my predecessor is watching, instead of paying politics and pressuring members of Congress to block the bill, join me in telling the Congress to pass it.
Now, Speaker of the House Mike Johnson blasted the speech as hyper-partisan, even as some members of his conference wore Trump campaign paraphernalia into the chamber. This was the Speaker as he departed last night.
Usually in a State of the Union, you have at least segments of it that are bipartisan, where we can unify and agree on things. President Biden gave none of that tonight. It was a completely hyper-partisan speech. I don't know how else to describe it. It was a campaign speech and a pretty vitriolic one at that. And so, you know, people are saying that I made funny facial expressions. I tried to keep a poker face, but it was very difficult. I disagreed so vehemently with so much of what he said.
Today, NBC's own Peter Alexander spoke with Vice President Harris, who sought to draw further contrast between the president and his opponent.
I'll tell you something. If you want to just look at the split screen to understand what's at stake, on the one hand, you've got Joe Biden, someone who is competent, who is principled, who has accomplished more than many presidents even hoped for, be it on infrastructure, on climate, on health care. And on the other side of that split screen, you've got the former president who glorifies dictators and has said he'll be a dictator on day one, someone who has said that he will weaponize the Department of Justice against his political enemies.
Meanwhile, as the president prepares for an extended road trip, Mr. Trump is staring down the start of his first criminal trial in the New York hush money case. That's set to begin March 25th. Today, he posted a $91 million bond in the E. Jean Carroll case as his attorneys appeal the $83 million defamation judgment. Joining me now to break this all down, NBC's Monica Alba, who's following the president in Pennsylvania. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard is at an R-N.C meeting in Houston, and NBC's Blaine Alexander is in Gwinnett County, Georgia, one of the deciders counties we are watching through November. And NBC's Ryan Nobles is on Capitol Hill. Monica, I have to start with you. You are in Pennsylvania, one of the biggest battlegrounds where President Biden is set to speak tonight. What has the reaction been from inside Biden world after last night's fiery State of the Union? I know that you've been talking to your sources all day.
Absolutely, Kristen. You know, heading into this address, there was a little bit of anxiety about it falling so late in the calendar. Remember all the discussion last week about could it potentially be in the middle of two looming funding deadlines for a government shutdown, and what could that all mean? And I have to tell you that advisors and aides today could not be more grateful for how this fell in terms of it coming 2 days after Super Tuesday, and they feel they're able to build on this momentum now that the general election is firmed up. They really feel like they couldn't have drawn it up better in terms of some of the energy that the president brought to the speech last night, and they want to directly translate that here to the trail. That is their hope and that is their goal with all of this travel that you're about to see. And last night, of course, the president was referring to the Republican frontrunner as my predecessor, not by name, but you'll see something different here, I'm told. He's going to be, of course, taking those same themes and that intensity that he likes to draw in terms of the contrast between himself and Donald Trump here in these remarks, and he's going to continue that. And in talking to voters here in the Philly suburbs, which you know well could be critical to the election in 2024 in November, they really told me that what they were watching for last night is what they ended up seeing, that they want to see Joe Biden bring that kind of vitality, that feistiness. They think actually that they don't see enough of it, and they wanted more of it on issues like immigration, on issues like reproductive rights and beyond, especially also on defending democracy, which is something the president always raises when he's here in Pennsylvania, which these days is pretty often, Kristen.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Monica. Very quickly, you talk about some of those key issues. One of the issues he took head on last night was the issue of his age. What are his allies saying about how that played and how he can continue to combat some of the criticism and concern?
So he road tested some lines in that Seth Meyers interview a couple of weeks ago about it doesn't really matter what age you are, it matters, he argues, how old your ideas are. And that was one of his big closing lines, concepts, and thoughts last night that I'm told he's going to be repeating for the next 7 months, which should come as no surprise. And in talking to the voters that I was checking in with today, in terms of any concerns they had about age, they felt like addressing it head on the way he did last night is something he should continue to do. And the campaign really feels like coming and doing these events and then having some smaller stops where he's doing personal interactions with voters like he's doing right now before he gets to this event is the key to that, and to slowly convincing people that he is fit for another 4 years in office, despite being the oldest president ever to serve. What we'll have to see, Kristen, is if the polls bear that out, because that has still been a top concern that's reflected. But after this, does this help chip away at any of that anxiety? That's what people are going to be watching for in the coming weeks.
You're absolutely right, Monica. One of the top concerns for voters, but we'll have to see if he turned it around in that reset in his State of the Union. Thank you so much, Monica Alba. Good luck out on the trail. Vaughn, let me go to you now. You are at that R-N.C event where they recognized Trump as the presumptive nominee and voted in a new Trump-friendly leadership, including his daughter-in-law. Not a surprise. We were expecting this, but it is significant nonetheless. Break down the stakes and what this means.
Right, especially that, in fact, Kristen, that Ronna McDaniel, the R-N.C chair, who resigned from her post here today at the same time, has been at the helm for 7 years now. We are now less than 8 months until the November general election, so it's really a head-turning time to change leadership. Michael Whatley has been a longtime ally of Donald Trump. He hails from North Carolina. He did take the gavel as the chair of the R-N.C. and was also joined on stage by the new co-chair, Laura Trump, of course, Donald Trump's daughter-in-law, who is coming in and taking on that number 2 position. There are serious questions about whether some of the senior staff who were a part of the R-N.C. up until today whether come next week they will still have their jobs, or whether the Trump campaign, as they effectively merge with the R-N.C., will all but implement their own senior staff and all but take over the R-N.C. operationally. Chris Lasavita is the chief operating officer now of the R-N.C. He also has been serving for the last year and a half in the role of campaign co-manager for the Trump campaign, which he'll continue to also serve in. But this is really a moment for this Republican operation around not only Donald Trump, but also these key Senate battlegrounds to make a concerted effort on a united front to try to make up financial ground, but also political ground for what the Democrats have been effectively been able to operationally build over the course of the better part of 3 years.
And that's really going to be the challenge, I think, Vaughn. Let's talk about some of the raw figures here. President Biden's team is going up with a $30 million ad buy. We also know that former President Trump just posted a $91 million bond to E. Jean Carroll. Do Trump and his allies have cash on hand right now?
You know, I think part of the context of this here is the fact that in 2020, folks will recall, Kristen, just how overwhelmingly Trump and his allies were outspent by Joe Biden and the Democrats. About $1.6 billion went towards Joe Biden's campaign and the affiliated super PACs. Compare that to just over $1 billion for Trump and the super PACs tied to him. And so what you're seeing this go around is a similar situation. And of course it's a concern, and it's at the forefront of their minds. Chris Lasavita told our colleague Garrett Haake as such that funds are the biggest concern, not only for Donald Trump on the legal front, which Lasavita says that the R-N.C. will not contribute funds towards any legal-related expenses, but obviously to put staff in these key battleground states and to go up on the airwaves, it's going to take those funds. And for Donald Trump, he is not only focused on the political, but he's focused also on just being able to pay the damages that he owes E. Jean Carroll, but also the damages stemming from the financial fraud civil suit now, and the future of the Trump Organization, his family business, not only the future for him as a business leader, but also for his family.
All right, Vaughn Hillier, thank you so much for covering all the angles from the R-N.C. meeting. We really appreciate it. Blaine, let me go to you. You're in one of our deciders county. Tell us about it. And what are you hearing from voters after last night's State of the Union address?
Well, you know, Kristen, what's interesting, one, is that most of the people I spoke to today didn't even watch last night's State of the Union address. So that's certainly telling when it comes to how much of an impact it makes on crucial counties like Gwinnett County. But one thing that is very clear from talking to voters today is that nobody is excited about the choices before them in 2024. But what changes is what they plan to do about it. Two people told me that they actually voted for Joe Biden back in 2020, but this time around, they're either leaning toward a third-party candidate or just staying at home altogether. Then I spoke with another woman who told me that she voted for every race in 2020 except for president. She just couldn't bring herself to vote for Trump or Biden, but she says that since then she's come to realize there's just too much at stake to not cast a ballot, so she's really dedicated herself to becoming informed and making a choice come November. Here's a little bit of what I heard from voters today. Take a look.
I actually did not vote for the president. I didn't. I voted for all other seats, but I just couldn't bring myself between the two to vote for either.
You couldn't go for either one, Biden or Trump.
Yeah.
We're looking at the same choice now.
Yeah.
Biden or Trump.
And that's why it's still very much in the air.
People don't want to vote, period, because they're not confident in either candidate.
And these are people who voted in 2020
Yes.
for Biden.
Yes.
And they're telling you now
They just don't know if they're going to vote. And it's sad because to me, it's allowing other people to be your voice.
So here's what's interesting, Kristen. That last woman that I spoke to was somebody who actually, in her words, that went out and beat the pavement. She is somebody who knocked on doors back in 2022 for Stacey Abrams. And the people that she was talking about were people who were doing that right alongside her. Now she says in 2024, because of what she calls a sense of disappointment on their behalf, she's now having to convince them to actually cast a ballot. But I want to just widen out and tell you why this actually matters so much. We're talking about, of course, Georgia, the state of Georgia, battleground state. Both candidates are going to be here this weekend. So it just underscores the importance of the state. But when you talk about winning Georgia, you really talk about winning counties like Gwinnett County. This is a place that back in 2008, Barack Obama lost by 10 points. And in 2020, Joe Biden won by 18 points. So Democrats have had their eyes on Gwinnett County for quite some time. If I can tell you a story, I remember in 2016 covering this as a local reporter, covering the election. That was, of course, the night that Donald Trump won. I spoke with the leader of the state Democratic Party. He told me that they are excited because they saw gains in Gwinnett County. That would be the key to flipping the state. And sure enough, 4 years later, that's exactly what happened. Kristen.
Fascinating, Blaine. And there is no better education about what is happening right now than hearing from the voters. So thank you for bringing that to us. We really appreciate it. Just underscores the frustration with this rematch. Always great to see you, Blaine. Thank you. Ryan Nobles, my friend, let me go to you after a late night for both of us. You are as bleary-eyed as I am. We did hear a little bit from Speaker Johnson today reacting to President Biden's State of the Union address. He was incredibly critical. What is he saying? What's the fallout been today?
Yeah, I mean, Speaker Johnson seemed kind of disappointed that he felt that the speech was a little bit too partisan and that he is in some way trying to find ways to work with President Biden. But I don't think we should probably read too much into that. You know, as you and I talked about last night right after the speech, I mean, that room was super partisan, both with Republicans and Democrats. There didn't seem to be too many areas where either side was looking for areas where they could work together on some of these big issues that they're facing. But I do think it sets the stage here for what is really a really important couple of deadlines. Of course, right now, the Senate's working to complete the first tranche of that spending bill. They have a second one coming up on the 22nd of this month, which could lead to a pretty significant government shutdown. And then, of course, there's the broader conversation about the supplemental aid package. They cannot get any of that done unless they work together. So the idea that this speech was maybe a little bit too partisan could get that last sprint here to the finish line off to a bit of a rocky start. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone was too surprised about the way the speech played out.
That certainly does make sense given all of the reaction that we've heard today. Ryan, let me ask you, speaking of working together, about this bipartisan effort that's going on right now that could actually end up banning TikTok. And today, President Biden is saying, yes, he would sign this bill if it gets to his desk. What's the latest there? Are you expecting it to pass?
I am expecting it to pass the House. We'll see what happens in the Senate. The House could vote on it as soon as next week. But I have to tell you, Kristen, having covered this building for quite a while and seen a number of different creative lobbying efforts, I don't think I've ever seen a bigger self-own than the one that the TikTok organization attempted by putting up this prompt on TikTok accounts of young people around the country that prompted them to immediately call their members of Congress and tell them not to ban TikTok. It backfired in a major way. Both Republicans and Democrats were so annoyed by it. Many of the people who called them seemed completely uninformed about the bill itself. They got a real sense that TikTok was misinforming their users as to exactly what this bill is about. It's not about a ban of TikTok. It's just about separating ByteDance, this Chinese-owned company, separating it from TikTok itself and making it be put in the hands of an American owner. And I talked to Raja Krishnamurthy, who's one of the ranking member of the Chinese subcommittee, and he told me that this unified both Republicans and Democrats in a way that he didn't expect, because it demonstrated how TikTok can be used as a way to perpetuate misinformation. And if anything, it's emboldened them to get this bill over the finish line.
Not a whole lot of things that can bring Democrats and Republicans together right now. So it's certainly significant that this bill may be one of them. Ryan Nobles, thank you so much. Hope you get some rest this weekend, my friend. Good to see you. Thank you. You can catch more of my colleague Peter Alexander's interview with Vice President Kamala Harris tonight on NBC Nightly News. Do not miss it. Coming up, seeking an alternative, I'll talk to the national co-chair of the group spearheading the effort to get a third-party presidential candidate on the ballot in November, a move that could tip the scales in a tight general election rematch between President Biden and Donald Trump. Plus, emergency mission response, how the Israeli government is reacting to President Biden's sharp words at last night's State of the Union about its handling of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. The presidential ballot could get very crowded very quickly. This November, after months of speculation, the group No Labels met this morning to affix a label to its 2024 political plans. They're running. In a virtual meeting earlier today, the centrist organization decided to move forward with a third-party presidential ticket this November, though the group has not publicly said whom it's considering to put on the ticket. But they hope to make an announcement as soon as they accelerate their candidate outreach and finalize a process for selecting a ticket. Now, No Labels says they have ballot access in at least 16 states, including battlegrounds, Arizona and North Carolina, and are actively gathering signatures in other states. Joining me now is former North Carolina Republican Governor Pat McCrory. He is a co-chair of No Labels, and this is his first interview since the group's meeting this morning. Governor, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate it.
It's great seeing my friend again. Thank you.
It is great to see you. So we are all sitting on the edge of our seats. You are going to run a ticket. Can you tell us who's going to be on the ticket?
Well, let me first say Mike Rawlins, the former Democratic mayor of Dallas, did a great job in running a meeting with over 800 delegates who have worked with No Labels for years, representing every state in the union. And there was a clear consensus that if not now, when? We have a nation divided, and we have two presidential candidates in which 65 to 70% do not want to rematch, and in which each candidate, even at last night's speech, talked past the people, and they yelled at each other, and they acted as though this is a Democratic or Republican convention scenario. This is a time for governing. This is a time for problem solving. This is a time for civility. And that's what the delegates told us today. And so next week, next Thursday, No Labels will be announcing the process that we'll be using to select a presidential slate for the No Labels ticket.
Well, let me try to push you a little bit to give us a name. The Wall Street Journal is reporting that No Labels is considering former Georgia Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan to lead the ticket. Is that true?
I think it would be very inappropriate for me to start listing names of people considered, or people who are submitting their names to us, or people that we've reached out to, because that's been happening over the past several months. And if I start mentioning one name, then I have to mention a lot of names. So we will look at people from government, from the military, and from business. And we look forward to telling you and the nation about that process, and then getting our delegates involved in that same decision. Listen, we have a chance to win this thing. This will not, by the way, you mentioned battleground states. If we get in this race, this will not just be a race with 7 states. This will be a nationwide race, and it's about time.
Governor, I'm going to challenge you on that notion that you think you can win. But before I do, let me just try one more time. Do you rule out Jeff Duncan as a possibility?
I'm not mentioning any names, whether in or out. You're not going to get me to do that, because there are a lot of good people that I think are qualified, would be great candidates, and to rule someone in or out would be totally inappropriate at this point in time. I'm an old recruitment manager from many years ago, and in recruiting, you have a large pool of candidates and then select the best from that pool of candidates, and that's what we're going to attempt to do.
Well, let me ask you, you say you think you have a shot at winning. I have seen the polling like you have. It's yes, in the double digits in some cases, but you know as well as I do that a third-party candidate has never won a presidential election. So why would this moment be any...
Abe Lincoln did.
In modern history, I should say, in modern American history. Why would this election, Governor, be any different, especially given how divided the country is right now?
Because we've never seen this division. When Ross Perot ran, about 40% of the people disagreed with Bush or Clinton at the time, 40%. And at one time, Perot was leading in the surveys at 35%. And it's winner take all in each state. This is not a national campaign. This is a state-by-state campaign, winner take all, except for 2 states. So it's not who gets the 50% and who gets the plurality. of all the candidates involved. And right now, 65 to 70% of the people do not want a rematch. We've never seen that in American history. So to look back at American history is not benchmarking the right way.
Governor, let me ask you this, because we heard this from No Label CEO Nancy Jacobson over the last couple of months. Last July, she told my colleague Vaughn Hilliard, quote, "We will not spoil for either side. The only reason to do this is to win." But then last month, she told The Atlantic, this organization is not in it to win it. This organization is in it to give people a choice. So which is it? Are you in it to win or not?
I'm not sure that second quote is probably the whole story in what she said, because Nancy, who was the visionary leader of this group, decided this concept of that the country can do better. The two parties are failing us. They haven't solved the immigration problem. They haven't solved the deficit problem. They can't get together on Ukraine, the Middle East, Israel, you name it. They are not doing any work. They're not governing. And the people are shouting, we can do better as a country than the two people that the two parties have nominated, despite what the majority of American people are saying. They want some common sense solutions to some very complex issues that are being kicked down the road.
Nancy Jacobson is saying she does not want the candidates to be a spoiler. If you get to a point where it is September and you're looking at the polls and you realize you will be a spoiler for President Biden, for example, what would you do? Would you then advise the candidates to drop out of the race?
I'm actually more worried about either Trump or Biden being a spoiler for us. And you might want to ask them the same question. Would they drop out of the race if they saw a third-party candidate from No Labels winning and having a choice? So I think that can apply to everyone involved at this point in time, come September, October, or even right before the election.
All right. Former Governor Pat McCrory, I have a million more questions for you, so you're going to have to come back. Please come back when you have some candidates to announce. We're going to stay on top of this.
I love your round table anytime.
Well, you are always welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you soon. Coming up next, do your part. That's President Biden's message to Israel as the humanitarian crisis facing Palestinian civilians in Gaza intensifies. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett will join me next. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Another major focus for President Biden last night during his State of the Union address was the ongoing war in the Middle East amid rising concerns about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza as the U.S. ramps up its efforts to get in more aid. The president specifically called on Israeli leadership to do more, emphasizing that humanitarian aid should not be used as a bargaining chip. And in a sign of his growing frustration with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president was caught on a hot mic as he was making the rounds following his speech while huddling with Senator Michael Bennett, who had recently visited the region. The president appeared to say that he told the Israeli prime minister that they will need to have a, quote, come to Jesus moment. An aide to the president quickly stepped in to remind the president that the microphones in the room were still on. President Biden addressed that hot mic comment this afternoon.
Why does Mr. Netanyahu need a come-to-Jesus meeting? What are you hoping to achieve?
I didn't say that in the speech.
After the What about after the speech?
You guys eavesdropping on things.
But does that show your level of frustration with him on humanitarian aid? Does he need to be doing more?
Yes, he does.
Joining me now is Naftali Bennett, the former Prime Minister of Israel. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to get your reaction. Of course, President Biden delivered his State of the Union address last night. He did address the war. Let me have you listen to a little bit of what he said and get your reaction on the other side.
Israel must allow more aid into Gaza to ensure humanitarian workers aren't caught in the crossfire. For the leadership of Israel, I say this: humanitarian assistance cannot be a secondary consideration or a bargaining chip. Protecting and saving innocent lives has to be a priority.
What do you make of the fact that the president chose this huge platform to seemingly call out the Israeli government? And do you agree with that statement that he just made?
No, I don't. I don't agree. The problem is not the amount of aid going into Gaza. The problem is that Hamas is hijacking that aid, robbing that aid,
taking it to itself and then selling it back in the black market in Gaza at about tenfold the price, and many Gazans can't afford it. So again, we are not using this as a negotiation chip or anything of that sort. The problem is that Hamas is stopping that aid from reaching the people who need that aid, and that's why we have to defeat Hamas, clean Hamas, and then form a new Gaza.
Well, I guess the question is, and the Biden administration would agree with your assessment, what you're saying about Hamas, but the question is, why can't the U.S. and Israel work together on expanding humanitarian access? For example, he announced this new port to get aid into Gaza. Shouldn't the U.S. and Israel be working together on that?
We are. Israel certainly is happy about these elements or any methodology of bringing in food into Gaza. But again, once it reaches Gaza, you have the Hamas terrorists who take over and siphon off a big portion of the food, so some people in Gaza don't get that food. And I want to emphasize, we are talking about a terror government that unfortunately was elected by the people of Gaza in democratic elections. But that's the problem here. We have a terror organization that tells us we want to repeat the murderous massacres of October 7th, go in and rape Israeli women and kill Israeli children and sever heads of Israelis just like we did last time. And that's why we have to eliminate this organization for the benefit of Israelis and the benefit of Gazans. And the best way to solve this problem is to accelerate the defeat of Hamas.
Do you, though, I mean, given the scale of the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding inside Gaza, and I understand what you're saying about defeating Hamas, but does the Israeli government bear some responsibility for that and for the death toll that is mounting? And is there not more that the Israeli government can do to prevent the death toll from rising?
We are bending over backwards to reduce as much as possible the death of civilians. However, Hamas is bending over backwards to increase the number of dead Gaza civilians by denying them food, by hiding behind civilians, sometimes shooting at its own civilians who want to run away from harm's way in areas that we afford them to do that. So you have an organization who is deliberately doing everything to ramp up the number of its own dead people, so then you'll ask me these questions and to apply pressure on Israel. What we need is to finish off Hamas. We're very much making progress, but now we're being stopped to some degree by the international community. This is a very bad idea because Hamas is the problem, not the solution.
How do you respond to President Biden, though, who has said he thinks that Israel can do more?
I think we're doing everything we can. I don't agree with that statement. President Biden is a great friend to Israel, but on this specific issue, I think the best way to make this whole thing go away and solve the problem is to give us the leeway and the backing to finish the job of cleaning up Hamas so everyone in this region can live peacefully, and it is possible.
I would like to talk to you about the discussions that are underway to try to secure the release of more hostages in exchange for a temporary ceasefire. Can you give us a status update? Because our latest reporting is that those negotiations had hit a significant roadblock. Do you think there is any expectation that a deal can be reached by Ramadan, which starts next week?
I think the chances, unfortunately, are low because Hamas is saying no. We had agreed on a program which would indeed release some of the hostages in return for a temporary ceasefire for a few weeks. America and the international community endorsed this plan, and Hamas is saying no.
So given that, does that mean that a ground invasion into Rafah is all but inevitable at this point next week? And doesn't that just mean that the civilian death toll will rise even farther?
Well, the only reason that we need to go to Rafah is to clean up Hamas, where the remainder of Hamas is. I want to emphasize, we have absolutely no desire to enter Rafah or enter Gaza for that matter. We left Gaza about 16 years ago or more, 17 years ago. We have no territorial claims on Gaza. We've got nothing we want to do with Gaza. We just want to live in peace. It's Hamas that attacked us from the very Gaza that we handed the Palestinians, and they say explicitly we're going to do it again and again and again. So essentially, we have absolutely no choice but to defeat Hamas. I wished this were not the case, but it is a very cynical and very evil organization, terror organization, and we just really have no choice.
And just to be very clear, does that mean that a ground invasion into Rafah next week? Should people be bracing for that sometime next week? And I know that there's going to be an attempt to try to get the civilians out of harm's way. How will that be possible? Where will they go?
Well, first of all, I cannot anticipate, what the precise military actions will be. I can say what I would do if I were Prime Minister, and I would proceed to let the civilians move away from Rafah to the north, to the area of north of Khan Yunis. There's a great amount of space there to afford for their movement. And then once the civilians have evacuated, yes, I would enter Rafah and clean up Hamas in Rafah. So that would be, we're talking about 2 to 3 months of the process.
Very quickly, because I'm getting a wrap, but is there really any safe place for them to go? You're talking about displacing these people to the north. Can you guarantee that that's safe, Mr. Prime Minister?
Yeah, there are safe havens that we do not attack because there's no Hamas infrastructure. This is not a good thing. I don't want to present this as if this is something that we want to do, that we enjoy doing. But if you had a terror state on your neighborhood, in your neighborhood, adjacent to where you're living, and they tell you, we killed your daughters, we raped your daughters and killed your sons, we're going to do it again, the only way to do away with it is to remove them. That's what we're facing. We have absolutely no choice. So, yes, that's what I would do.
All right. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me here.
Coming up after the break, we have seen quite the response to last night's Republican response by Alabama Senator Katie Britt. The panel joins me next. You're watching Meet the Press now.
Mr. President, enough is enough. Innocent Americans are dying, and you only have yourself to blame. Fulfill your oath of office, reverse your policies, end this crisis, and stop the suffering.
Welcome back. That was Alabama Senator Katie Britt going after President Biden's handling of issues tied to the border and immigration. It came as part of a blistering and emotion-filled Republican response to President Biden's State of the Union. It was also an address that garnered as much attention for its tone as its message. Joining me now to discuss this, my great Friday panel, Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters, Symone Sanders-Townsend, former chief spokesperson for Vice President Harris and now a co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, and Matt Gorman, Republican strategist and former senior communications advisor for Tim Scott's presidential campaign. Thanks to all of you for being here. A lot to break down. Let me start with you, Jeff. What are you hearing from Republicans and, frankly, Democrats to the Republican response?
I just kind of wonder why anybody says yes to that. Because you think about the multiple responses that we've all watched or covered that just haven't gone well. You know, I think in terms of, a real response to the response, as it were, when she is somebody who they want to lift up, she is, or at least was, a rising star. And a lot of what she said are exactly the things that people in the Republican Party and in former President Trump's base want to hear. Maybe the delivery itself didn't go as well as people might have hoped, but that's certainly, those are the issues that needed to be lifted up, whether it was her or whether it was somebody else, as far as they're concerned.
Matt Gorman, what are you hearing?
It's a tough spot to be in no matter what. You think of it this way, right? You are going from a chamber where at least half the room, if not always, some of it is cheering for the president, no matter what party, saying that the State of the Union is strong, optimistic, there's just an energy in the room, and you have to shift within minutes to kind of a docile setting, no matter where it is. It is thankless. And also the tone, it has to be a little bit more pessimistic. Again, it was a little bit more optimistic, this one towards the end, but you have to set a contrast. These things, you always are just trying to do as little harm as possible, not even do no harm, just as little harm as possible.
Yeah. Symone, what did you make of it? Obviously, it's getting criticized for the tone today. But it was a preview of the message, the battle lines that are going to be drawn. Symone has a lot of thoughts. I can see.
Why was she in a kitchen? Why was she in the kitchen? That was the only question I had last night. Why was she in the kitchen? And I got some kind of answer today from Senator Tuberville when he said, well, she was there as a housewife. Katie Britt is the junior senator of Alabama. Prior to assuming the role of senator, she led the Alabama Business Council. She was the chief of staff in the office of the seat that she now sits in. What we saw last night was the opposite of what everyone who has ever advised a woman politician, elected official, business executive, a woman in a position of power should do. The junior senator from Alabama does not belong in her kitchen in a blouse, a nice blouse. Okay, it's a lovely blouse, but she doesn't belong in the kitchen in her blouse. And if that is the message that, like, the people that got together said, she's going to come from her kitchen, she's here as a wife, a mom, they're missing the mark.
Can I add one thing?
Please.
In terms of content, one of the quotes that I think she released ahead of time and then said during the address was that President Biden was diminished. I don't think that line landed after his speech last night, because the president, and I think the president wanted very much to not come across as diminished, and he didn't. He came across very much in charge of what he wanted to say.
It's a really great point. She was expecting to deliver that line with the hopes, presumably, that President Biden would have delivered a different caliber of performance. Matt, I want to play a little bit of what Ronna McDaniel had to say. She had some parting words today for Republicans as she stepped down for R-N.C. chair. And of course, it comes as 2 Trump loyalists, including his daughter-in-law, have been installed as the leaders. Let's look.
We cannot put our head in the sands and ignore abortion and the Dobbs decision. Many of our candidates chose to ignore this issue and not talk about it. And the R-N.C. was a leading issue, urging candidates to talk about this issue head on. In 2022, candidates mattered. Candidates always matter. But the candidates who won were able to articulate a message on abortion and also attract and win swing and independent voters. We are going to have to replicate that if we're going to win in 2024.
Matt, what do you make of what she said and of this new leadership at the R-N.C.?
Well, first of all, she's not wrong when it comes to abortion. I mean, look, you talk with people who were deeply involved in the Virginia legislative elections last year, and they would go and they said, look, we went through it every different way, from some of the most conservative ones to, talking really pro-woman, and nothing was working. And they would say, you talk about different numbers, and it's, can I get you 15? How about 20? Can I 30? It's trying to sell a car. It's like a negotiation here. It's like, no. And so that is something that is a challenge. And you look at the polls, Trump 2 to 4 points on average about, but we saw this going into 2022. Do Democrats overperform on Election Day? That would keep me up nights if I was the Trump campaign.
To what extent is abortion going to be a centerpiece of President Biden's re-election campaign? He obviously talked about it last night. The vice president's been talking about it for quite some time now. Symone, are Democrats banking on this issue to get them over the finish line in November?
I think they are definitely banking on this issue to be helpful. The vice president today, I believe, is in Phoenix, Arizona, and another stop on that tour talking about reproductive rights. And I thought that there was a tell because for the president to put Roe so high up into his speech and to really take the fight directly to the Supreme Court justices sitting in the chamber. I mean, goodness, the cameraman deserves an Emmy for what we saw last night. So Democrats have moved to put abortion on the ballot in a lot of places, Arizona, Florida, right, coming up, and everywhere abortion has been on the ballot previously, it has done well and won. So I think it will be a help for them, but it won't be the only thing. Abortion is an economic issue for so many people, and other economic issues coupled with abortion are going to be important.
And, it was smart, too, because if writing in the speech to take on the Supreme Court and not just call it the GOP, right? You call it the GOP, it'll get noticed, but it won't be a takeaway. The Supreme Court, to their face, sitting, 15 feet in front of you, that's something that will get TV packages and it'll be noticed after the speech a lot longer.
It was an extraordinary moment, Jeff. And again, this goes back to what you were saying, this performance aspect that resonated with a lot of Democrats, frankly, that allowed them to breathe a sigh of relief that he showed some real fight last night. The challenge is, can he keep it going? He's in battleground Pennsylvania today. He's going to be in Georgia this weekend. What are you going to be watching for in that regard?
Well, I think I'll be watching for whether or not they put him out more like that. I mean, the thing about Joe Biden is, and at least I covered him during the Obama years and have been following him for a long time, he loves that stuff. He loves that interaction. He used to love interaction with the press. And then he became president, and we have a lot less interaction with him. They would dispute that because he does talk to us on his way to the helicopter. But that's a long way of saying, will they put him in more situations where he can have that kind of banter? Because I think it shows, and I think they want to show, that he's got the mental acuity that he needs and that anyone would need for that job.
Symone, do you think we're going to see that?
Look, I think so. Well, the question is, I want to know, did the president do local news, local media when he was out on and about today, when he was on his trip? Is he going to do that in Georgia? I think he likes engaging. I think when last night the engaging worked well for him. I mean, he had to be, they turned the lights off on him in the chamber, right?
He was still shaking hands.
But again, last night was the biggest stage he's going to get. He was feeling good, riding high. He had the stage, he had the podium. I think over the next couple of months, they're going to ride that wave, but there are policies that the president talked about in the speech last night that I really believe are going to help move the needle for them even more than just his performance.
All right, guys, thank you so much. Great Friday conversation. Jeff, Symone, and Matt, really appreciate it. And still to come, it's the economy. We're breaking down today's new jobs report after President Biden touted his economic record in last night's address. Stay with us. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As President Biden hits the campaign trail after last night's State of the Union, the Labor Department reported today that the economy added 275,000 new jobs last month, exceeding economists' expectations. The unemployment rate did tick up a bit to 3.9%. NBC News business and data correspondent Brian Chung joins me now. Brian, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. Happy Friday. So tell us what this February jobs report tells us about the state of the economy right now.
Well, I mean, Kristen, you heard it yesterday as well from President Biden. The landing is and will be soft, referring to economists' expectations over a year ago that we would have been in a recession. You don't see that in the jobs numbers, which was corroborated by the numbers that we got this morning, showing 275,000 jobs added in the month of February. Check this out. Economists had only expected about 200,000 for the month, so above expectations. And yes, there are a little bit of nuance. They revised down the December and January figures, and the unemployment rate did take up to 3.9%. But we've remained below a 4% unemployment rate for the entirety of this chart that I'm showing you, and even beyond. Now, where did we see the job gains in the month? We saw it in these categories: leisure and hospitality and healthcare. Interestingly, these are blue-collar jobs. In the white-collar jobs, I want to highlight information and professional and business services, which added in aggregate only 11,000 jobs. We've been hearing of some tech layoffs in the past few months, so these are threads we're going to have to watch in the months to come, Kristen. But overall, this jobs market looking very strong.
Yeah, we did hear President Biden tout that in his speech last night. And of course, the challenge for him and for everyone is making sure that people feel it, because right now, a lot of Americans saying they don't yet feel the impact of these numbers. Let me ask you, we received a report yesterday that layoffs in February reached their highest point since 2009. How do you have a strong jobs growth with so many layoffs? How do you square that?
Yeah, and a lot of those layoffs that we've been hearing about as of late have been in that tech sector, which makes up a relatively smaller portion of the economy than, let's say, for example, bars and restaurants or our healthcare sector. So, yeah, those layoffs are happening, but it's not large enough to be really impacting the overall pie. But to your point about the feel of the economy, a lot of that has to do with this figure, inflation, which the Biden administration acknowledges is an issue, right? The prices at the stores. So wages, though, in this report, it's above the pace of inflation on a yearly rate, 4.3% compared to 3.1%. That dynamic, though, only flipped as of around the spring, summer last year. How long does it take for Americans to start to see and experience that? That's the open question that I'm sure the administration is thinking about headed into the election, Kristen.
There is no doubt about that. Brian Chung, thank you so much for breaking it all down for us. We really appreciate it. Hope you have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks.
All right, and we will be back on Monday with more Meet the Press Now. And if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press on your local NBC News station. I'll have exclusive interviews with Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator-elect Adam Schiff, plus Senator Raphael Warnock. Do not miss it. The news continues with Tom Costello in for Hallie Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.